This show is all about interviewing interesting people and learning. When I say the name JonBenét Ramsey, what do you think? Well, if you know the case, you probably think about this photo here. This stunning little girl, right? She was murdered. And if you know the case, you might think about her mom and her dad, who many believe killed her. Now, they have since been cleared. Her murder, though, remains unsolved to this day. And right now, there is a fascinating documentary out on Netflix. It is called Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey? And the executive producer, Craig Dentrone, is joining me now to talk more about it. Craig, thank you so much for coming on. It was so well done, first off.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your continued interest in this case. It keeps up the attention on it, and it keeps the encouragement on the Boulder police to do the work to solve it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a 3-part documentary, and it was so in depth, and you guys went through so much, as far as the media, as far as the footage that you aired to in this documentary. How long did it take you, though, from start until finish to get this out there on Netflix?
It took about a year.
Okay.
And you're right that there's a lot of material to go through, especially there's a lot of archival material from the media to go through, because in 1997, it was the #1 news story in the United States of America, and it was heavily, heavily covered everywhere in the news, but also obviously in the tabloids, in tabloid TV. So there's a lot of that. What there isn't a lot of is actual evidence, because the case is still active, still open, and 99.5% of the actual evidence in the case is still under seal. So what there is there's a mountain of media, but not a mountain of actual evidence to look at in this case.
Yeah. How did you get involved in this project?
Well, I've been working with director Joe Berlinger and the production company Radical Media for several years, and I had been lucky enough to work with Joe on a previous project. And Joe Berlinger has done several documentary series for Netflix that lots of people would recognize, and a lot of people have watched. And Netflix had been talking with him about making a series about this case, and so Joe asked me to help him out.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that you had John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, involved so heavily, and the Ramsey family, I mean, it made such a difference too. Before you got involved in this project, and just knowing, maybe kind of, following from afar the case, before you really got involved, what did you think happened to JonBenét?
I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I obviously, I remember, I was old enough to remember the case, and obviously remember the heavy, heavy media coverage of it. But I remember even feeling at the time that, it felt a little icky to, to really get involved in following this case. And so over the years, I think I never paid that much attention to it. And so when it came to me, and it came to Joe to start looking into it, I think we came to it with a pretty blank slate. I remember hearing something, oh, the parents were involved, that kind of thing, but didn't know much more than that. So we really started at the beginning to just familiarize ourselves with the basics of the case and what happened. And I think that worked a little bit to our advantage, that we weren't really saturated in the media coverage from decades of really entertainment coverage of the case, and we were able to start with just the facts and just real research. Also, there's a little bit of an advantage to starting now, because a lot of the important information of this case took years and years to actually come out. The first 3 years, when there was heavy media coverage, was a time where the Ramseys really could not talk, and really could not tell their own story, and where a lot of the information just wasn't available yet. So when you look backwards from now, you can see it a little more clearly, well, maybe a lot more clearly than media could at the time.
Yeah, I would say a lot more clearly. And I mean, I vividly remembered it. And just for background for y'all at home, I lived in Boulder, Colorado until 1995, until I was in middle school. My father was a CBS national correspondent, and so we had moved to Texas, and then he went back to cover the murder case for CBS News. But I mean, I vividly remembered it, and just like a crazy connection the pediatrician who was JonBenét's pediatrician was my sister's pediatrician in Boulder. So Dr. Buff, I saw him in the documentary, and I mean, he completely vouched for the Ramseys, in this documentary. And it was interesting because he was one of the only ones who was raising his hand saying, no, these parents are incredible parents. And it was like, the Boulder Police Department just completely, turning another eye.
Yeah, he does play a very important part in this case. There were these accusations levied against the Ramseys, in the media, especially in the tabloids. National Enquirer is really where it came from, that they had engaged in abuse of their daughter. And there was just no evidence of that. And of course, the way that we find out about abuse of children is through people who are trained to observe and trained to understand the kind of behavioral changes and emotional changes that children can manifest when that's happening to them. And Dr. Buff is one of those people. He's a pediatrician who was trained and required by the state, by law, to report anything he would find that could show any kind of abuse. And he had seen her many times and had absolutely insisted that there was no sign of abuse whatsoever. Also, I mean, all of the people who knew the Ramseys personally, their friends, their relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, neighbors, parents of JonBenét's friends, anyone who actually knew them or came across them, there isn't a single one of those people who ever said that there was some kind of abuse going on or that they suspected it. All of the abuse accusations really came from the media. They came from places like the National Enquirer and the Globe and the Star, not from people who ever met JonBenét Ramsey.
Yeah. And, we don't want to give away everything with a documentary because we obviously, if you haven't seen it, again, go see it. It's completely worth it. But it really is the most comprehensive look at how the Ramseys were railroaded from the beginning, starting with the Boulder Police Department, who they go into this thinking, yeah, mom and dad did it, and they had tunnel vision. Kind of like a doctor who has already diagnosed someone with a problem. They have already diagnosed the fact that the Ramseys have murdered their daughter, and they come up with all these different scenarios. Maybe, JonBenét wet her bed, and so Patsy freaks out and kills her daughter. I mean, just wild scenarios. But you guys break down, all these different theories, and it was really just fascinating to see all of that. And one of the lines that I thought was fantastic that John Ramsey, the father, said, he said, basically, he wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that John or Patsy did it because the media, the police department, they put it out there. I mean, there were detectives who were doing interviews at the time who said, oh yeah, I mean, John and Patsy, they did it. There were shows. Geraldo Rivera held a mock trial where the Ramseys were convicted. It was, I mean, if you were alive at the time, you thought that the Ramseys did it. And I don't know how you would think otherwise.
Yeah, the amount, really, the story about the Ramseys killing their daughter, it is a story, it's not the truth. But that story was very appealing to people. People wanted to hear that story. I think they continue to want to hear that story. When you look at all the media across the years about JonBenét Ramsey, there have been lots and lots of books written. There have been so many TV specials. Anything that suggests that one of them was involved in the murder makes a lot of money and gets a lot of ratings. The books that accuse them, they sell.
Yeah.
The books that don't. There are like the journalist Paula Woodward wrote an incredible, I think the best work of journalism on this case, an incredible book about the case. It's the most thoroughly researched thing you could possibly read. And it didn't sell nearly as well as the 10 books that accused them of the murder based on nothing. It's really something that people want to hear. And the entertainment companies and news organizations know that. And it's just like catnip to them. They just keep going back to it and wanting to tell that story.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, when we started seeing these photos of JonBenét, the child beauty pageants, and Boulder too, it is a smaller, I don't say it's a small town, it's a smaller town. There are very sophisticated, intelligent people who, you know, live there, call it home, a lot of money, but it's also kind of a hippie town. And so I think that when people started seeing this, you know, I mean, this is more of a Southern thing, you know, beauty pageants. And I think, you know, for Patsy, who came from Atlanta, it was more of a thing. And I think for people to see that, bing, bing, you know, like the alarm bells were going off immediately. And that was just weird to a lot of people. And that was also something that raised a lot of alarms and immediately said, well, these people are weird, and that's probably why they killed their daughter. Now, again, child beauty pageants is one thing. Killing your daughter is a completely different thing.
Yeah, the whole world of child beauty pageants, you know, to someone like me, I mean, to most of us, is just totally bizarre. I mean, we
Right.
don't,
Yes.
that's not my culture. That's not
Right.
most of our culture, and we don't understand it, right? But there's an important thing to remember here is that when you see those images on national TV, they take on an entirely different significance than what they actually had when they were filmed.
Right.
I watched every second of every video of her in a pageant, and I can tell you those videos were taken in a hotel conference room in the middle of Colorado where there might be 12 people behind the camera, you know, cheering on their kids, and those are moms and grandmas, you know, cheering on their kids. Those videos were made for them, for that little community, 20 people, not for the whole nation to see. And when they were put in front of the whole nation, people thought, oh my God, how could you put your daughter in that situation? But they didn't. They didn't. Those videos and those photos were never meant to be seen by anybody but Patsy and JonBenét and maybe Patsy's parents. They weren't meant to be seen by the whole world. And one thing that John Ramsey says that I think kind of sums it up, it's like, he says, it's like if you went to the swimming pool and you took video of your kids in the swimming pool, and then all of a sudden it turned up on national TV as pornography.
Yeah.
That's the way it's treated, and it's not. That's not what it was.
Mm.
It was play. It was dress up. Patsy had been in pageants when she was younger. She won Miss West Virginia, and JonBenét knew that, and she had seen film of Patsy winning the pageant, and had always said to Patsy, "When can I do that? When can I do that?" And after Patsy recovered from ovarian cancer, or was in remission from ovarian cancer, and really barely survived it, that became something that they did together. And it was a little community of moms and daughters in Colorado and in other states who knew each other, who liked each other, who had fun, and they would get together and play dress up. And at the end of those pageants, one thing that people don't know is if you actually watch them, every kid gets a sash. Every kid gets a crown. They made it sound like Patsy was some kind of like pageant mom who was pushing her kid to be famous. It wasn't true. It was just kind of a fun activity that they did for themselves, amongst themselves, not intending for anyone to ever see it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, if you took a video, as you said, or photos even of your kid in a bathtub, and back in the day, if they were developed at a film store, you could get in trouble for that potentially. And I mean, kind of the same thing. God forbid something were to happen, and you know the police start looking at you with a fine-tooth comb. You know, God knows what could happen. Something too that came up quite a bit was just the way that JonBenét was killed, and it was horrific. And you guys really went into depth about that. And I mean, this was not kind. She was tortured. She was sexually assaulted, and it was critical to the case. And it was like the Boulder Police Department. It just kind of glazed over the detectives, who, frankly, and they didn't have a lot of homicide detective experience anyway.
They had none. They had no experience. You know, the lead detectives on this case, this was the first homicide they ever investigated. And since one of the lead detectives, resigned a couple years into the case, he was 0 for 1
Mm,
for his career. That's the kind of experience they had. And really the horrific brutality of the
mm,
crime the, is the key to
hmm.
understanding it. And that makes it very difficult. It is so horrible that it's natural for people not to want to know that.
Hmm.
It makes sense. It's so terrible that you want to look away from that. And it's a very difficult thing for to even kind of say on TV
Hmm.
what happened to her. And I think that changed people's perception about it. People did not understand what actually happened to her. It's probably the worst way a child could die. It's hard to even imagine how terrible this was. And I think that allowed for a lot of theories to spring up about the Ramseys because any theory you hear about the Ramseys, if you go online, you can get any flavor of theory about the Ramseys being involved. You can hear that John did it. You can hear that Patsy did it. You can hear John and Patsy did it together. You can hear that Burke did it. Burke and John did it together. Burke and Patsy. You can get any version of the Ramseys did it, but they all rely on this one thing. And that is that the most horrific aspects of the crime are fake.
Mm.
All the theories about the Ramseys come down to that is staging. The really terrible, terrible things that happened to her are staging. That they killed her essentially by accident and the rest is fake. It's not.
Hmm.
It's not. The autopsy shows clearly that she was alive when the most horrific
Hmm.
things were being done to her. The autopsy proves that. Those things aren't fake. Any theory about them would have to reckon with why they would do that to their child. These people who had no history of any kind of violence leading up to this. None. No history of abuse before or after. This was done by a monster,
Yeah.
a person who is a monster among us, and they exist.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to this girl. And it's just hard for us to reckon with that. And the closest people to blame were the parents.
Mm. Yeah, and the thing that I think is so frustrating that you guys really highlighted was the DNA. And so we knew later on you find out, and I remembered that you find out that there was DNA found at the crime scene that didn't match any of the Ramseys. And that really was kind of the reason that it would be very difficult to prove that they had anything to do with this murder. And the fact that the Boulder Police Department tried to tie the DNA to a factory in China where her underwear was made just shows you the length they were willing to go to pin it on the parents, which was ludicrous. So the DNA, when you guys highlighted the fact that the DNA did not match, was brilliant the way that you did that. And I mean, clearly that was the case. That was the case right away. But it wasn't the case. I mean, it was like they continued to try to pin it on them even after the DNA was not a match.
Yeah, the Boulder police detectives hid the DNA tests not only from the public for a long time, but even from the Boulder District Attorney's office. They would not give the results for months and months. And one of the key things to understand about this case is that it remained in the jurisdiction of the Boulder Police Department for decades, except for a very short period where it was transferred to the DA's office and then back to the Boulder Police Department. And the entire time it was at the Boulder Police Department, it was really under the command of the same detectives who were on it in January of 1997. Really up until about 2 years ago, it was the same detectives who controlled the case. So the people who could have ordered new DNA testing, the people who could have done more work, were the same people who spent 1997 and 1998 feeding the media information saying that the Ramseys did it. And so all this time, that passed where they could have been investigating it, quite frankly, it's pretty clear that they weren't. They just stopped. After there was a grand jury investigation and they couldn't charge the Ramseys, they just stopped investigating. They didn't do any work for decades. And that means that there has been no new DNA testing. Now, fortunately, there is a new regime at the Boulder Police Department. And finally, the last detective who had been on the case from the beginning, was suspended. Really, not suspended, but taken. He had his cases taken away from him because he had screwed up so many, and so it was finally essentially in new hands. Really, only the last almost 2 years that it's been in new hands, and we think in the hands of people who actually do want to solve this case.
Yeah, and really, I mean, they just need to do this DNA testing, correct?
That's what John Ramsey has been calling for, the DNA testing. Obviously we hear a lot of different things that are hard to verify about the DNA. The Boulder Police Department says that they've done testing. We don't know. They say that the evidence that they have would be destroyed with new testing. That may be. We don't know. They're not transparent about this stuff. So it's really sort of a guessing game from outside about whether or not they have done the DNA testing. And whether they're doing enough, and whether there actually is evidence, as John Ramsey says, that has never been tested and should be tested. So, the Ramsey family has been calling very clearly on the Boulder Police Department to do that work, and if they won't do that work, to bring in outside agencies or accept the help from outside agencies, because the Boulder Police Department has to do that. It's not like the FBI can just step in and say, hey, let us take over. No, the Boulder Police Department has to ask for their help, accept their help. And to this point, they've been pretty reluctant about doing that and bringing in experts. Of course, they say they have, but there's not really any evidence from the outside that they have.
Yeah, and of course, the big thing that just never was investigated was an intruder theory, which another detective, a famous detective, came in and said he believed that it was an intruder. There was a suitcase by an open window that would have allowed someone to step on a suitcase and get out if they had come in through this window to commit this horrible, disgusting crime. And that was never investigated. That was never pursued. Do you believe that that is ultimately what happened, that it was an intruder?
There's just a lot of evidence that points to an intruder. There really is. And there was from that morning. There was a window that was open. The grate that led to that window could easily have been lifted up. It just was not hard to get into that house. Other things that, we couldn't even get into the documentary, things like, the house had an alarm system. It was off. They never turned that thing on. It was kind of thing where their alarm would go off at random times. You know how that can be very annoying if you have an alarm in your house or your car and it goes off at random times. So they just stopped turning it on. It was a safe neighborhood. So the alarm wasn't on. It was easy to get in. They weren't great about locking their doors, locking their windows. A lot of us aren't and can forget those kinds of things. It just wasn't hard. There was a back door that apparently was open, definitely unlocked. It wasn't that difficult to get in and out of this house. And of course, the Ramsey family was away for several hours on Christmas Day, when someone could have got in and spent a lot of time figuring out how to get around that house, how to get to JonBenét's room, how to get JonBenét from her room down to the basement, how to get out without setting an alarm. If the person, as Detective Lou Smith, the great, legendary Colorado detective, believed, if that person got into the house while the Ramseys were out at dinner at their friend's house, that person would have had 5-6 hours to figure out exactly how they wanted to do this.
Yeah, and of course there were sex offenders who were in the area who could have committed a crime. There was even a case, kind of a similar case, that was not even investigated, that, where a guy had broken into a house and was about to sexually assault a young girl, and never tied, the dots, never connected the dots either, that might have been, the person who killed JonBenét.
Yeah, in September of 1997, about 9 months after this crime, there was another break-in attack of a young girl. And I think that's something to really highlight, that it wasn't that, it's very scary to know this, and to think of this, but it wasn't that unusual for there to be these intruder attacks. Unfortunately, that those happened before this attack on JonBenét Ramsey and after, where someone would break into a house and attack a girl or a woman. That happened. And the fact that the Boulder Police Department couldn't imagine that that was possible when it was happening, there are multiple incidences of it in Boulder before the crime and after, is kind of baffling. It was a thing that some very, very sick and horrible people did.
Yeah. I'm sure you spent a lot of time with John Ramsey. Did you?
Yes. Yeah.
How is he doing?
You know, if you think about what John Ramsey has been through, it's hard to imagine anyone else who even has been through the amount of pain and tragedy he's been through.
Just hell.
His oldest daughter died in a car crash. His oldest daughter from his first marriage died in a car crash. Then his youngest daughter, JonBenét, was horrifically murdered. Then he spent a couple of years being the most hated person in America in the media. And then after that, his wife, Patsy, died from ovarian cancer. I mean, the amount of things that happened to this man that he did not bring upon himself are just unimaginable. But if you meet him, he really has something special to give to the world because of the amount that he has been through. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out, really through his faith. He's a Christian, and he has a lot of faith, and he spent a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to live with grief and what to do with his grief. He spent a long time, I think he spent almost a year in India, helping people in poverty in India. He spent a lot of time kind of wandering and really searching his faith, and he came out with a lot of life lessons. He wrote a book about it that, unfortunately, not a lot of people I think have read, but is really beautiful. And it's really kind of lessons from someone who has been through grief that, any part of that grief, for most of us, I think would probably destroy us. And, he went through a lot more of it than any of us can take, and has come out the other side and is lives a pretty good life. He has his adult children. He has grandchildren. He is married again. He lives with the grief of having lost his oldest daughter, his youngest daughter, and his wife. But he also has found ways to appreciate the fact that they were in his life. He says to us, he's at a point in his life where he can say to himself, well, I was lucky to have JonBenét in my life for 6 years. And it's a pretty amazing thing to be with someone who has been through that and can tell you that.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think the documentary too just does such a good job of explaining why they didn't cooperate. And at the time when you kept hearing the Ramseys are not cooperating, they're not cooperating with police, they're not cooperating with the media or whatever. Maybe they would do an interview with CNN, for example, but they really weren't cooperating. You understand why once you watch the documentary.
Yeah, and really it's a hard thing to explain because they did cooperate. There's one thing that they wouldn't do, which was that they would not go down to the police station and have one of those videos that we've all seen in every kind of true crime, documentary, where there's a hidden camera up in the corner, and the police detectives grill them and get them to confess or slip up in some way. That was the only thing that their lawyers wouldn't do. Everything else that the police asked for, they did. They gave blood samples. They gave all their credit card records, their phone records, their bank accounts, everything. They gave information about all their friends and relatives, and all their friends and relatives spoke to the police. The only thing they wouldn't do was sit down for that grilling, because they know that when the police have a solution already in their minds where they've said, oh, we know what happened, that's very dangerous. That's a trap. And any decent lawyer would say, no, we're not going to do that. They offered other ways of doing it. They said, let's do the interview in a neutral place. Let's do it with our lawyers, sitting next to us. The police refused to take any of those. They said, we're only going to accept you coming down to the station and letting us grill you without your lawyers individually. And that's what they said no to.
Yeah, and they had great legal advice. I mean, obviously they certainly did have great legal advice, but I mean, it essentially bankrupted them too, because they had that legal advice, and that was not cheap.
Yeah, I think there was a myth about the Ramseys that they were exorbitantly wealthy. They were wealthy. They had a good amount of money. And what John Ramsey says is that he had more money than he ever imagined he'd have in his life. John and Patsy started a little company from nothing in the basement of Patsy's parents' house. That's how they started their company, and they were just in the right place at the right time, where what they were doing with computers became hot all of a sudden, and Boeing came in and bought John's company. And so all of a sudden, the family had a bunch of money, right? They weren't like Bill Gates or something like that.
Yeah.
You're talking about, millions, but not tens of millions, hundreds of millions, millions, which is a lot of money. But when you're accused of a crime like that, and you have the entire nation and the media coming after you, and where he couldn't work anymore, that money went quick. And it was really less than 3 years later where they were completely broke. I mean, totally broke.
Yeah. It was amazing too to look at all the old footage, and I say old because it's not that long ago, but it was so fun, not fun, but interesting to look at, the old police vehicles. And it literally, I mean, it was, the 90s, but it looked like they were from the 1970s. And I'm sure you probably got a kick out of kind of looking at some of this footage, because it did look really old. I mean, it wasn't the HD quality that we are so used to nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different media environment. There was obviously the internet was in its infancy.
Yeah.
The very first, internet, like chat rooms, the very first like internet true crime communities did spring up around this case, really. But they were really, really early on, and they weren't as powerful as the mainstream, old media, which was TV, especially the nightly news reports, and also tabloid magazines. This was a time where every supermarket in America, you would go to the checkout line, and there'd be a bunch of magazines right there: National Enquirer, Star, Globe, People. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, every person in America who bought their groceries would see the most horrific headlines about this family, saying they killed their daughter. I mean, it would be almost impossible for them not to be vilified in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Do you think, just talking with John, do you think they kind of regret anything? And I'm sure, I mean, looking back, I know that, there was the interview with Patsy where she seemed, a little medicated, and that didn't make her look great. There was the Burke, I saw this and I was going, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. Burke did a Dr. Phil special, and it was awful. And it was, and I say awful because he was still a kid at the time. And I mean, a little socially awkward, I would say. But I felt bad for him. And I think that I'm assuming, I don't know, I'm assuming that was where a lot of the speculation continued to grow, that he had something to do with it. Now, mind you, he got a huge settlement after, I don't know if it was after the Dr. Phil or not. You can fill me in on that. But were there some things that John told you that maybe they wish they had done a little bit differently as far as some of these interviews go?
Oh, certainly. I mean, they have a lot of regrets about, especially about their interactions with the media. The CNN interview is one of them.
Yeah.
The Dr. Phil is another. There's really no playbook for how to do these things. Having your child murdered and then being accused of it in the national media. Who could do that right? But as far as Burke goes, yes, the Dr. Phil interview was a disaster for them. But really, where things went very, very bad for Burke was that there was a detective whose name is James Kolar, who wrote a book that accused Burke of the murder. Now, James Kolar, if you look at the cover of his book and you read it, you might think, oh, this is a detective who worked on the case. He didn't really. He worked on
Wow.
it for a couple of months, many years later. He basically did paperwork. But then when he was trying to sell his book, tried to sell himself as like a lead detective on the case, he hardly knew anything.
Hmm.
And he wrote a book that's really based on nothing,
Hmm.
that accuses Burke of and this is where this pineapple theory really comes from, is from a book by this guy named James Kolar. Well, in 2016, CBS, uh, through a production company, bought the rights to that book, to
Hmm.
James Kolar's book that accuses Burke of the crime based on nothing. And they made this 2-night special. And what the 2-night special did was it appeared to assemble a team of experts to reinvestigate the case. Now, tens of millions of people have seen this special. I'm sure lots of people watching this have seen this
Hmm.
special. It was a 2-night special. It aired in prime time on CBS. In the special, they pretend like they are investigating the crime. But what they actually did was, it's basically a reality show where they act out James Kolar's book.
Hmm.
They had the rights to that book, they optioned the rights to that book, and they turned it into a 2-night special that looks like a documentary.
Yeah.
And so they look like they're investigating the case when the entire time they know that they are building the story of his book that points the finger at Burke.
Hmm.
It is one of the most egregious and terrible examples of television journalism, if I can call that, that I have ever heard of.
Hmm.
It is filled with lies. And in fact, the Ramseys did end up suing CBS and the production company. And I'll tell you, it's hard to win a defamation case against somebody like CBS. They have the best First Amendment lawyers available, and they have a lot of money. And the Constitution does protect, speech and make it hard for you to win defamation cases. Well, they won that case. I mean,
Yeah.
CBS had to settle, and they had to settle pretty quickly because, even in the pretrial motions, they were losing over and over and over because it was filled with demonstrable lies. But I will say, that 2-night special, it continues to have a major influence on what people think about this case.
Ugh.
It continues to have a presence online in the Reddit communities that are really focused on Burke. They always go back to that special and to that book. And really, those are just examples of people doing whatever they had to do to make money off this case. It's pretty terrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. You feel so terrible. And for this family, for Burke, his sister was murdered. I mean, just in just a disgusting, disgusting way. And people just, it's like, they have no soul. I don't know how else to describe it. But yeah, it's just awful. Um, kind of looking forward, moving forward, that's kind of the goal, right? Is that they're hoping that the Boulder Police Department will do something, will have the DNA retested. And if that doesn't happen, then this case will just remain unsolved, correct?
Yeah, it really is up to the Boulder Police Department. Anyone who feels strongly about this case, no matter what you think happened, and you want to see justice for JonBenét Ramsey, you really have to look to the Boulder Police Department and encourage them to do the work, because there's nobody else who can. The case belongs to them. They have jurisdiction over it. And unless they decide to hand off jurisdiction over it to another agency, or to call in or accept the help from experts at the FBI or from other agencies who have much more experience investigating cold cases like this, it's going to be up to them. And so we can really only hope and keep encouraging them to do the work to find out who killed JonBenét Ramsey.
I know a filmmaker and a director and an executive producer, and I think about this too. After I'm done with a project, I always wish maybe I'd done something maybe a little bit differently, or maybe I'd added this, or I wish I'd gotten something from the cutting room floor into the special. Is there something that you wish that you guys had been able to include that you were not able to include? Something that was left on the cutting room floor that you wish the audience was able to learn or see that you can share with us now?
Yeah, I do wish that we had spent more time on Burke and the theories around Burke. I think we didn't
Yeah.
quite appreciate how deep rooted this theory is out there.
Yeah.
How many millions of people truly believe that he had something to do with this. And they really believe it because the media fed that to them. And, there are a lot of people who were very upset about our series, and said, they say things like, oh, the Ramseys funded this and it's propaganda, things like that. And what they point to is like, oh, they never dealt with the pineapple, which is this theory about Burke that he killed his sister because he was mad that she ate his pineapple. I wish we had dealt with that more. It is an absurd theory. We know exactly where it comes from. We know how it was developed. It was a theory that was developed for money, for profit, no doubt about it. It has no bearing on the truth. And there's so much evidence to show that Burke had nothing to do with this. I mean, the morning of, within hours of the actual murder, the police took Burke out of the house, brought him to his friend's house, and interrogated him that morning, maybe 7 or 8 hours after JonBenét died. Police officers interrogated Burke without his parents there, without a lawyer there, for over an hour, and they came away convinced that he had nothing to do with this. That was that morning. And yet people will point to a Dr. Phil interview to say that he's guilty. Yeah. It makes no sense. The grand jury interviewed Burke under oath. The grand jury prosecutors questioned him under oath. Those grand jury prosecutors made announcements saying there's no way this kid was involved. They had him under oath. And yet people point to Dr. Phil and this CBS special with the pineapple. I wish we had been able to really go into the theories about Burke and show why they just cannot be true.
That's really interesting that you say that. And it's interesting, too, that people are saying that this might have been funded by the Ramseys or whatever, and that, because, again, I feel like this really is the first comprehensive look at why they didn't do it. Because forever and ever and ever, you've heard why they did and why Burke did and why the Ramseys did. And so again, you have to hear all sides. You have to hear the evidence. And the evidence was that she was brutally murdered, sexually assaulted. It was absolutely disgusting. The DNA didn't match. There was an intruder that was never investigated. And there were, child sex offenders in the area. I mean, I don't know. And the Boulder Police Department had no homicide experience. I don't know how else to wrap it up a little bit. But I mean, it was just, it was, and the other thing too, Craig, too, and you probably are getting some of this as well, there's a whole new generation that is learning about this case, and you guys you're teaching them about this case, and that's kind of like the Menendez brothers, same thing with Netflix. Younger people are learning about them because of these true crime specials.
Yeah, it was really interesting. People basically born around 1990 or before, they know this case. They lived with this case, and we had people also who, people who were born around 1990 who were 5, 6 years old when this happened. They say this is one of my earliest memories. It was a time when I went to the grocery store and I saw these tabloids, and I realized, oh my God, this can happen to a child like me. And it was the first time they really thought about the fact that they could die. And it made such a big impression upon them. But people born afterwards, almost none of them have heard of it. It was an amazing split. And the people who kind of grew up with it, that's really where you have people who are really dedicated to the idea that the Ramseys were involved. Because those are people who were really saturated in the media that told them that. Yeah. The people who afterwards, they have a little more distance from it and are able to look at it more objectively and say, no, that just can't be.
Well, again, it was really well done, and I completely recommend it. It's called Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey. It's out now. Craig, thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your continued interest in this case.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And thank you for watching this episode of The Curious Bee with Ellen McNamara. We have more episodes up right now. They're for free on Fox Local.